For better or worse, this is gendered, this is all sorts of things, but this is Carl Jung on the archetype, on the concept of the archetype. The concept of the Great Mother belongs to the field of comparative religion and embraces widely varying types of mother goddess. The concept itself is of no immediate concern to psychology because the image of a Great Mother in this form is rarely encountered in practice, and then only under very special conditions. The symbol is obviously a derivative of the mother archetype. If we venture to investigate the background of the Great Mother image from the standpoint of psychology, then the mother archetype, as the more inclusive of the two, must form the basis of our discussion, though a lengthy discussion of the concept of an archetype is hardly necessary at this stage. Some preliminary remarks of a general nature may not be out of place. In former times, despite some dissenting opinion and the influence of Aristotle, it was not too difficult to understand Plato's conception of the idea as supraordinate and pre-existent to all phenomena. Archetype, far from being a modern term, was already in use before the time of St. Augustine, and was synonymous with idea in the Platonic usage. When the Corpus Hermeticum, which probably dates from the 3rd century, describes God as the archetypal light, it expresses the idea that God is the prototype of all light, that is to say, pre-existent and superordinate to the phenomenon of light. Were I a philosopher, I should continue in this Platonic strain and say, somewhere in a place beyond the skies, there is a prototype or primordial image of the mother that is pre-existent and superordinate to all phenomena in which the maternal, in the broadest sense of the term, is manifest. But I am an empiricist, not a philosopher. I cannot let myself presuppose that my peculiar temperament, my own attitude to intellectual problems, is universally valid. Apparently, this is an assumption in which only the philosopher may indulge, who always takes it for granted that his own disposition and attitude are universal and will not recognize the fact, if he can avoid it, that his personal equation conditions his philosophy. As an empiricist, I must point out that there is a temperament which regards ideas as real entities and not merely as noumena. It so happens, by the merest accident one might say, that for the past 200 years we have been living in an age in which it has become unpopular or even unintelligible to suppose that ideas could be anything but noumena. Anyone who continues to think as Plato did must pay for his anachronism by seeing the supracelestial, the metaphysical essence of the idea relegated to the unverifiable realm of faith and superstition, or charitably left to the poet. Once again, in the age-old controversy over universals, the nominalistic standpoint has triumphed over the realistic, and the idea has evaporated into a mere flatus vocis. This change was accompanied, and indeed to a considerable degree caused, by the marked rise of empiricism, the advantages of which were only too obvious to the intellect. Since that time, the idea is no longer something a priori, but is secondary and derived. Naturally, the new nominalism promptly claimed universal validity for itself in spite of the fact that it, too, is based on a definite and limited thesis colored by temperament. This thesis runs as follows. We accept as valid anything that comes from outside and can be verified. The ideal instance is verification by experiment. The antithesis is we accept as valid anything that comes from inside and cannot be verified. The hopelessness of this position is obvious. Greek natural philosophy, with its interest in matter, together with Aristotelian reasoning, has achieved a belated but overwhelming victory over Plato. Yet every victory contains the germ of future defeat. In our own day, signs foreshadowing a change of attitude are rapidly increasing. Significantly enough, it is Kant's doctrine of categories, more than anything else, that destroys in embryo every attempt to revive metaphysics in the old sense of the word, but at the same time paves the way for a rebirth of the Platonic spirit. If it be true that there can be no metaphysics transcending human reason, it is no less true that there can be no empirical knowledge that is not already caught and limited by the a priori structure of cognition. During the century and a half that have elapsed since the appearance of the Critique of Pure Reason, the conviction has gradually gained ground that thinking, understanding, and reasoning cannot be regarded as independent processes, subject only to the external laws of logic, but that they are psychic functions, coordinated with the personality, and subordinate to it. We no longer ask, has this or that been seen, heard, handled, weighed, counted, thought, and found to be logical? We instead ask who saw, heard, or thought. Beginning with the personal equation and the observation and measurement of minimal processes, this critical attitude has gone on to the creation of an empirical psychology such as no time before ours has known. Today we are convinced that in all fields of knowledge, psychological premises exist which exert a decisive influence upon the choice of material, the method of investigation, the nature of the conclusions, and the formulation of hypotheses and theories. We've even come to believe that Kant's personality was a decisive conditioning factor of his critique of pure reason. Not only our philosophers, but our own predilections in philosophy, and even what we are fond of calling our best truths, are affected, if not dangerously undermined, by this recognition of a personal premise. All creative freedom, we cry out, is taken away from us. What? Can it possibly be possible that a man only thinks or says or does what he himself is? Provided that we do not again exaggerate and so fall a victim to unrestrained psychologizing, it seems to me that the critical standpoint here defined is inescapable. It constitutes the essence, origin, and method of modern psychology. There is an a priori factor in all human activities, namely the inborn, preconscious, and unconscious individual structure of the psyche. The preconscious psyche, for example, that of a newborn infant, is not an empty vessel into which under favorable conditions practically anything can be poured. On the contrary, it is a tremendously complicated, sharply defined, individual entity which appears indeterminate to us only because we cannot see it directly. But the moment the first visible manifestations of psychic life begin to appear, one would have to be blind not to recognize their individual character, that is, the unique personality behind them. It is hardly possible to suppose that all these details come into being only at the moment in which they appear. When it is a case of morbid predispositions already present in the parents, we infer hereditary transmission through the germplasm. It would not occur to us to regard epilepsy in the child of an epileptic mother as an unaccountable mutation. Again, we explain by heredity the gifts and talents which can be traced back through whole generations. We explain in the same way the reappearance of complicated instinctive actions in animals that have never set eyes on their parents, and therefore could not possibly have been taught by them. Nowadays, we have to start with the hypothesis that, so far as predisposition is concerned, there is no essential difference between man and all other creatures. Like every animal, there is no difference between people, between humans. There is no difference between humans and all other creatures. Like every animal, humanity possesses a preformed psyche, which breeds true to its species, and which, on closer examination, reveals distinct features traceable to family antecedents. We have not the slightest reason to suppose that there are certain human activities or functions that could be exempt from this rule. We are unable to form any idea of what those dispositions or aptitudes are which make instinctive actions in animals possible. And it is just as impossible for us to know the nature of the preconscious psychic disposition that enables a child to react in a human manner. We can only suppose that his behavior results from patterns of functioning, which I have described as images. The term image is intended to express not only the form of the activity taking place, but the typical situation in which the activity is released. Wow. These images are primordial images insofar as they are peculiar to whole species, and if they ever originated, their origin must have coincided at least with the beginning of the species. They are the human quality of the human being, the specifically human form our activities take. This specific form is hereditary and is already present in the germplasm. The idea that it is not inherited but comes into being in every child anew would be just as preposterous as the primitive belief that the sun which rises in the morning is a different sun from that which set the evening before. Since everything psychic is preformed, this must also be true of the individual functions, especially those which derive directly from the unconscious predisposition. The most important of these is creative fantasy. In the products of fantasy, the primordial images are made visible, and it is here that the concept of the archetype finds its specific application. I do not claim to have been the first to point this out. The honor belongs to Plato, the first investigator in the field of ethnology to draw attention to the widespread occurrence of certain elementary ideas was Adolf Bastian. Two later investigators, Hubert and Mauss, followers of Durkheim, speak of categories of the imagination, and it was no less an authority than Hermann Usner who first recognized unconscious preformation under the guise of unconscious thinking. If I have any share in these discoveries, it consists in my having shown that archetypes are not disseminated only by tradition, language, and migration, but that they can re-arise spontaneously at any time, at any place, and without any inside influence. The far-reaching implications of this statement must not be overlooked, for it means that there are present in every psyche forms which are unconscious, but nonetheless active, living dispositions, ideas in the Platonic sense, that perform and continually influence our thoughts and feelings and actions. Again and again, I encounter the mistaken notion that an archetype is determined in regard to its content. In other words, that it is a kind of unconscious idea, if such an expression be admissible. It is necessary to point out once more that archetypes are not determined as regards to their content, but only as regards their form, and then only to a very limited degree. A primordial image is determined as to its content only when it has become conscious, and is therefore filled out with the material of conscious experience. Its form, however, as I have explained elsewhere, might perhaps be compared to the axial system of a crystal, which, as it were, performs the crystalline structure in the mother liquid, although it has no material existence of its own. This first appears according to the specific way in which the ions and molecules aggregate. The archetype in itself is empty and purely formal, nothing but the facultas praeformandi, possibility of representation, which is given a priori. That's so beautiful. A possibility of representation, which is given a priori. That's what I said on Yuval Harari's page. The same thing. This what's been missing. The representations themselves are not inherited, only the forms, and in that respect, they correspond in every way to the instincts, which are also determined in form only. The existence of the instincts can no more be proved than the existence of the archetypes, so long as they do not manifest themselves concretely. With regard to the definiteness of the form, our comparison with the crystal is illuminating inasmuch as the axial system determines only the stereometric structure, but not the concrete form of the individual crystal. This may be either large or small, and it may vary endlessly by reason of the different size of its planes or by the growing together of two crystals. The only thing that remains constant is the axial system, or rather, the invariable geometric proportions underlying it. The same is true of the archetype. In principle, it can be named and has an invariable nucleus of meaning, but always only in principle, never as regards its concrete manifestation. In the same way, the specific appearance of the mother image at any given time cannot be deduced from the mother archetype alone, but depends on innumerable other factors.